I answered an ad that I had seen for a camp counselor. And it was, the job was looking after a bunch of young kids at the end of the school day, and you kept them for 3 or 4 hours, and you played with them in a park, or you took them to a museum, or what it was. And there were one or two other guys that were doing that as well. And they gave us these vans, these 15-passenger vans that were outfitted like school buses. You know, they painted yellow with the name of the camp on the side, and you'd be told where to go, and luckily I drove, and so, you know, I would do that. And one day we were in this park in LA, and I'm looking after my kids, and my boss, there was only my boss and his kids and I and the kids I was looking after, and we're playing games. And I see these two figures approaching me. They're jogging, and they're coming towards me, and it was one massive obese guy, bearded guy, and one little guy. And they come towards me, and just a few feet away from me, they go and they sit down on this low wall. And I look over, and I don't know why I even recognized him particularly, but it was Brian Wilson. And I look over, and I walk over to him, and I said, "It's Brian Wilson, isn't it?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "Hi, you know, my name's Brian too. I'm, you know, Brian Stanley. I'm a bass player, and you know, I just got here from England, and my boss sees me, and he whistles and he yells me back to work, and I go, "Well, great to meet you. Bye." And so we leave, and that's it. 2 days later, we're in the same park, and my boss is not around, and the same thing happens. The two guys come jogging, and they come and they say it's exactly the same thing, except my boss wasn't there. And I walk over to him, and I start talking. "Hi, you remember me? Yeah, how you doing?" And I said, "You know," I said, I'm finding it hard to find a gig in LA. And he kind of bows his head, and he goes, "Yeah, I know what it's like to not have a gig." And I remember thinking to myself, I'm talking to Brian Wilson, and he's telling me he knows what it's like to not have a gig? And of course he didn't. He'd been in his bedroom for the last 3 years eating Twinkies. And it turned out that the guy that he had with him was Eugene Landy, this psychiatrist. And if you know the story, he ended up being a really awful guy who ultimately got disbarred for putting his name on Brian's copyrights and whatever else he was. He had this thing going where he moved Brian out of his house, and he moved into Brian's house, and he rented a house for Brian. I mean, just all this crazy stuff, yeah. But this was at the point that the two of them had just met. Because at that point, Landy didn't have any control over him, because had he done so, he wouldn't have even allowed this conversation to take place. So Brian proceeds to take out of his pocket a piece of paper and a pencil. And he writes down his home address in Bel Air, on Bellagio, and his home phone number. And he hands me the piece of paper and says, "Call me up, I might have something for you." And I'm thinking, this is insane too, because I've given my name and number to a bunch of people. I never had any qualms about going up to whomever and saying, you know, "I'm a bass player and I would really love to play with you, and here's my name and number." Of course, nobody ever rings. But here, he's giving me his info. So, you know, I'm still the camp counselor, and I've got this van, and it was my transport to and from where I lived. And so I went home that night, and I dialed the number, and I got an answering service. And the next night I dialed the number, and I got the answering service. I dialed for a week solid, and then I never got past the answering service. "No, Mr. Wilson's not picking up." And I didn't leave a message, there was no point. And then the next week started, and I started calling again. And at the beginning of the week, I got his wife, Marilyn, on the phone. She answered, she explained she was his wife, and I tell her the story, and she said, "Okay, I'll give him the message." So the next day, I let it go. I didn't call. I gave him a day to call back to see whether he responded. He didn't call. I started calling again. And I remember very clearly, it was a Thursday. It was a Thursday evening. I got home, and I had the piece of paper in my hand, and I waved it at my wife, Liza, and I said, "It's the last time I'm going to call this number. This is silly." And I call the number, and Brian answers the phone. And I said, "Hi, you remember me? It's Brian Stanley, the bass playing camp counselor." He said, "Bring your bass to Brother Studio, be there Saturday, 11 o'clock, I'll see you there, bye, click." No other conversation at all. I didn't know what Brother Studios was or where it was. Obviously, it didn't take a lot of investigation to find out that it was the Beach Boys studio. It was in Santa Monica. I found where it was. I went there. I walk into the studio. There's Dennis behind the drums, Carl on the guitar, Brian's on the piano, Mike's walking around, and I'm thinking, this is different. And of course, it was before the days of electronic tuners, too. Right. So I didn't even have the help of at least knowing that I was going to be in tune, you know. So I'm tuning my bass up, and Brian's playing this tune. He's going through this tune. And so we run it through. We get to the end of the tune. And Brian, you know, he was sweet, but he was clearly troubled. I mean, he had this real tightness in his mouth. He was kind of chewing his lip, you know, and who knows what was going around in his head. And he's at the piano with this little upright, and I'm standing above him, looking down. He looks up at me. He goes, "You got it?" And it was one of those "you got it's" where the answer could only really be yes. And I said, yeah, I've got it. And Carl obviously sensed my trepidation and said, "Brian, give him a map. If I asked you what Pasadena was, I'd say, give me a map." And so I'm laughing to myself that here I am, I got this Beach Boys making this Pasadena reference, and it was all very funny to me. Wow. But there was no map to be had. We just ran through the tune again, and we cut the tune. And we got to the end of the tune, and I remember I played a fifth at the end where I thought I would have played a root, and as we listened to it back, I pointed it out to Brian, and and he listened. He was like, "No, good note, man. It was a good note." And of course, you know, he was the king of substitutions for bass, so the fact that I was playing this fifth was obviously pleasing to him, you know. And that was the end of the recording session, and they invited me to stay, and I walked to the other side of the glass, and I was as close as I am to you now on the other side of the glass, where these four guys, there was no Al Jardine walking about, was these four guys, you know, it was the three brothers and Mike, all grouped around this Neumann, layering upon layering of the most angelic harmonies I had ever heard. It was just a really extraordinary experience to see these guys just make their magic in front of my face. And, you know, when they finished, they said, "Thanks very much," and I left, and I ended up getting a check in the post, in the mail for the session, and I remember wishing that I could afford to not cash the check. And instead I photocopied the check, and it was on one of those really awful early photocopiers that fade, and somewhere in a box I'm sure I have what's left, the remnant of this check from Brother Studios.
That was the
from
track,
Brother Records.
That was on the MIU album.
That's correct. Okay. That's correct.